All right, we're going to focus here pretty much entirely on the origin of the War of Vietnam. We're not really going to get into any strategy or tactics or certainly the aftermath of the war. So, if this is really the only war that the United States has clearly lost, why did the United States enter the war in the first place? That's what we're going to seek to answer today. This is Vietnam. This is a small Southeast Asian nation. And when you talk about the United States and some of the wars it's been in and the countries it's fought, that this is the country that was the one that defeated the United States is on paper pretty incredible, and we're going to talk about how that happened over the period of the next couple days. So our story goes back a long time. Vietnam was one of those you know, uh, tons of areas around the world that just wanted its independence, that just wanted to be able to self-govern and get foreign influence out of their country. In terms of foreign influence for um, Vietnam, it was starting in the 1850s, the French that colonized that area, along with what's now Cambodia and Laos. Those three current countries made up what was called French Indochina. And the French ruled there, took a lot of their stuff, certainly, and then a lot of Vietnamese just wanted the French out. And so we're going to concentrate on the area in the 20th century. After World War I, as we know, that was a time of self-determination, right? And so if you're the people of Vietnam, this would seem like a great opportunity to get your independence. A man named Ho Chi Minh appointed sort of took it upon himself to represent the Vietnamese people and went to the Treaty of Versailles negotiations and wrote a letter to President Wilson arguing for Vietnamese independence and was ignored and just kind of cast aside. So obviously he was bummed out because he had great hopes for that time. And one of the things that he did while he was in France is joining the Communist Party. His motivation for doing that is that Russia was in the process of having its revolution. The Bolsheviks were taking over and establishing the Soviet Union. They were communist, so he thought if communism worked for Russian independence, essentially independence, but a revolution in Russia, it can work in Vietnam as well. So it was like communism is the tool through which Vietnam can get its independence, but ultimately a Vietnam controlled by Vietnamese people was his ultimate goal. It wasn't that he was some hardcore communist; it's that he was more of a nationalist. Though he did use communism and some brutal communist tactics when it came to that later on. During World War II, his attention shifted. Obviously, in 1940, the French lost to Germany or surrendered to Germany. Germany didn't have any interest in France's Asian colonies, so it gave that to Germany gave those colonies to Japan, who really wanted them. And so, during World War II, Ho Chi Minh formed a group called the Viet Minh. It's a guerrilla army force to fight back against the Japanese. So, if the Viet Minh are fighting against the Japanese and the United States are fighting against the Japanese, the Viet Minh and the United States would seem to be somewhat of allies on that side. We have the same enemy anyway. So after the war, after the Japanese were defeated and forced to flee, that would seem to be a time again where Vietnam could get its independence. And the hope from Ho Chi Minh's point of view was that those efforts in World War II would eventually lead to the United States supporting that independence. He would be wrong. So after World War II, France has to decide what to do. Do we try and reassert ourselves as a world power? Do we accept our fate as a secondary power? Obviously, they're going to want to try and reclaim power. And to do that, they tried to get back as many colonies as they can. Now, this is also at a time when a lot of other European countries, especially Britain, were getting rid of their colonies, were giving their colonies like India independence. And so France is doing the opposite, grabbing back onto their colonies once again. And again, picture Ho Chi Minh's enormous frustration. Other colonies around the world are getting their independence. Vietnam is not. And in fact, France is hanging on to it even harder. So you look to maybe a country like the United States. Are they going to support Vietnam in its independence or France in its colonialization? Well, because Ho Chi Minh is communist, and we know the attitude of the United States during the Cold War, the United States is going to side with France because any Vietnamese independence would probably lead to communism spreading in Southeast Asia, and that's not something the United States was prepared to accept. So here's where America's rigid black and white view of the Cold War is ultimately a negative for the United States. When Eisenhower becomes, that was all under Truman, when Eisenhower becomes president, he talks about containment policy in a bit of a different way. He says domino theory. And domino theory is the idea that if one country in an area becomes communist, then it will spread to the next one and the next one and the next one. It's just like if you stack up dominoes and knock the first one down, they all fall down. So the only way to keep all the dominoes standing is keep the first one standing. And so if you prevent any country from becoming communist, no matter how small, then that'll prevent everything from becoming communist. So is that a bit alarmist? Yeah, probably, but that was the line of thinking. Um, so as part of its frustration, the Viet Minh started guerrilla war against the French. Not a formal kind of battlefield type war, but small scale skirmishes and attack and retreat, booby traps, the kind of war that America kind of fought in its revolution. That's necessary a lot of times in revolutionary wars. Um, Now, while all of this is going on, the United States is paying for most of it, and even though France is losing, the United States is paying for most of the war, which is kind of a bummer. In 1954, the Viet Minh captured a major city in Vietnam, which is something that a guerrilla army really shouldn't, by definition, be able to do. This is a sign for the French that we just need to get the heck out of here. And they do that. There's a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, and both sides, the French and the Viet Minh, promised to stop fighting. There would be a temporary split of Vietnam into North Vietnam, which would be communist, and South Vietnam, which would be not communist. But that in 1956, a couple of years later, there would be elections that would eventually unify um, Vietnam, presumably under Ho Chi Minh. So why, if the Vietnam had such great momentum, why would they agree to this? First of all, they were out of money, and second of all, they were confident that they would win any kind of elections that would take place. So because of that confidence that Ho Chi Minh would win, the United States makes sure that these elections never happen. So the United States, this bastion of democracy and liberty of around the world, made sure that people couldn't vote. Another example of America's Cold War fears maybe getting in the way of its better ideals. The United States knew that South Vietnam needed a leader, so they supported this guy named Ngo Dinh Diem as a leader of South Vietnam. His main qualification was that he wasn't communist, but he was a brutal and corrupt dictator. He lived in extravagance while most of his people lived in poverty. He opposed Buddhists, which oppressed Buddhists. In Vietnam was 85% Buddhist. Diem himself was Catholic and didn't like Buddhists, so he oppressed them, and that's not great. So just a really brutal guy. But why did the United States support him? He said he wasn't communist, so I guess that was good enough for us. Just because the South Vietnam wasn't communist, the government wasn't communist, doesn't mean there weren't communists in South Vietnam. The communists in South Vietnam revolted and started fighting back against the South Vietnam government. They were supplied by the Viet Minh, and this group of communists in South Vietnam are called the Viet Cong. And they become a huge problem for the South Vietnamese government. Once the United States does enter the war, this is the side that this is the group that the United States is going to do most of its fighting against. Eisenhower does not send in troops. The war has not started yet for the United States, but Eisenhower sends in military advisors to help the South Vietnamese military organize, strategize, and fight back against the Viet Cong. And 900 were sent in by the time he was done being president. Once Kennedy becomes president, he is also a believer in domino theory and containment policy. Basically, no president wants to seem weak by seeing communism expand under their watch. So no matter what, they're going to oppose that. and especially for Kennedy after the screw up with the Bay of Pigs and the Soviets building the Berlin Wall, he needs to seem strong, and so he's certainly not going to let Vietnam fall to communism. And so, as the situation kind of gets worse, as the Viet Cong are getting stronger in South Vietnam, Kennedy also doesn't send troops. The war hasn't started yet, but he sends more military advisors so that in the 2.5 years of Kennedy's presidency before his assassination, the number of military advisors in Vietnam climbs from 900 to 16,000. So that's a pretty dramatic escalation. There's all kinds of dissent in South Vietnam. Buddhists, of course, oppose Diem's rule. And one of the significant forms of protest was when Buddhist monks set themselves on fire in protest. So a pretty graphic and certainly newsworthy protest. Obviously, Diem was not helping the United States efforts, and so he was removed from office via assassination, although that wasn't the plan from the United States point of view, in November 1963, and was followed by a series of inept military leaders in South Vietnam. South Vietnam never really had a good leader from an American point of view. Viet Cong is continuing to make gains, and President Johnson, who became president after Kennedy's assassination, also in November 1963, wanted to project American strength in that area, but he couldn't just send in troops by himself as president. We still have a constitution, so he needs Congress to help. And so historically, the United States only gets involved in a war, really only gets involved in the war when we're provoked, when we're attacked, but nothing has really happened yet until August 4th of 1964. It's announced that a U.S. Destroyer is attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and that the next day there were follow-up attacks. And so that would seem to be the basis for the United States going to war against Vietnam. But there's some enormous buts here. It never really happened. Those attacks didn't happen. Johnson made it seem worse because he wanted to seem more anti-communist before his 1964 election to his own term, for his own term as president. It wasn't announced, but the truth is that the USS Maddox was on a spying mission in territorial waters of North Vietnam, and it fired first, so any kind of firing on the Maddox would seem to be somewhat justified, and that the second attack never happened. So all of these things together caused the United States to go to war. Congress passed what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin is the body of water where this attack supposedly took place. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave Johnson complete authority to fight the war. And so this was used as justification for the United States getting involved in the war. We now know that it didn't happen, but the effect is the same as if it did happen. We're going to war. So tomorrow we're going to look at some of the strategy, the air war, the ground war, and ultimately what caused the United States to emerge unsuccessful from this war. So as always, if you have questions, please let me know.